Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this conversation about cacao and Guatemala and indigenous cultures, and specifically the term ceremonial grade cacao. I'm very, very happy to have Daillen Culver here. She's just completed her master's. She'll be sharing a little bit about that. But before I do ask her to introduce herself, I'm going to ask us all just to bring a hand to the heart. Allow the eyes to close. If you're working with cacao today, you can bring a cacao to your heart space. I'm just going to open up the space, invite the spirit of the conversation. Wherever you are located in the world, just connect a root down to that. I'm sitting here in South Africa and Daillen sitting in the UK. And so we just welcome in the entire globe, the north and the south, the east and the west, the above and the below. To the heart of the sky and to the heart of the earth and to our own hearts. Maltiosh, we give thanks. Just taking another 2 breaths in transition. If you're working with cacao, then please offer some to the land. If you are outside, take a sip into your body if you would like. So as I already mentioned, I met Daillen in Guatemala a few months ago and just couldn't stop chatting. I found it really interesting to talk to her because up until this point in my life, I haven't actually met anybody studying cacao through academia in person. So yeah, it was a wonderful opportunity just to hear about her research. She has just completed her master's in Anthropology of Food at SOAS University in London in preparation for a PhD. So we're going to hear a little bit later all about that. Her research explores the different material and the symbolic meanings embedded in the ceremonial grade cacao label, specifically in Guatemala. And she has intermittently lived and worked in Guatemala for the last decade as director of sustainable agriculture nonprofit, working with farmers and artisanal cacao producers. And she was recently introduced to the more modern conceptualization of a cacao ceremony and got interested in studying the confluence of indigenous traditions and new age spirituality through an academic lens. So absolutely fascinating topic for her research. Daillen, I would love you to just introduce yourself and add in any gaps, complete any bits there that I've left out. Correct me as well, please, because I had to read most of that.
No, can you hear me okay? Is the audio good? Yeah. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. You covered most of it. I, like you said, have worked in Guatemala for a long time, so got interested in the topic of ceremonial cacao kind of from 2 different angles. I was the director of a sustainable agriculture and nutrition nonprofit working in rural Guatemala, and a lot of the families that we were working with on agricultural extension were growing cacao. And then I also did my yoga teacher training in the years that I was living in Guatemala, where I did my first cacao ceremony, started seeing them popping up at yoga studios in the US, the UK, and was like, oh, this is really interesting. There's something going on here and nobody's studying it. And that was why I decided to make it the focus of my master's dissertation, and gathered more data during the month that I was in Guatemala in May than I could have ever possibly included in a master's level dissertation, and got some really amazing feedback from my supervisors. Everyone was like, this needs to be explored further, hence the forthcoming PhD. So yeah.
All right. And you're going to tell us a bit later what that is, or do you want to shoot away already?
So, I mean, first I need to get into the PhD programs. I'm doing applications right now. And I'll likely be back in the States because I work with indigenous peoples in Mesoamerica. There's a lot more expertise in Latin America by way of proximity in the US and Canada at those universities. So I'll be focusing on ceremonial cacao still, but my master's dissertation was really looking at the meaning embedded in the ceremonial grade label, which is a largely unregulated and undefined label. So I was looking at kind of the implicit meanings embedded in that emerging label. the PhD will expand that conceptually and geographically. So obviously my expertise is in Guatemala, but there are so many interesting ceremonial cacao operations cropping up in Ecuador, Peru, Bali, even places in Africa. And so this is really becoming a global phenomenon. And the PhD will take a kind of wider scope, but still looking at the um, dynamics of identity formation within this kind of very heterogeneous, diverse movement that is emerging, and the kind of commercialization of indigenous plant medicine. It's going to be a very interdisciplinary dissertation.
Amazing. Yeah, I look forward to it already. So let's backtrack a bit. What kind of medicine does cacao provide? I mean, those that are listening already can probably answer that for themselves. But from an academic perspective, what kind of medicine does cacao provide, and who and what is it intended to heal?
Yeah, so I think among my research participants and for anyone who's attended a cacao ceremony, there's this narrative around cacao being a heart opener. So it does deconstrict the blood vessels, increases blood flow, has obviously a high dosage of theobromine and trace amounts of caffeine that give you a kind of boost of energy. And while there's a lot of contestation actually around the physiological effects and the science, but undoubtedly, and I've experienced this myself, it gives you um, it gives you a feeling of being able to open in a way that you might not otherwise. This kind of openness to vulnerability and connection, and the narrative among my research participants is that it allows you to touch parts of yourself that you might not be open to otherwise. It makes you more receptive to interpersonal connection. Um, and then there's a kind of tangential narrative around feeling a greater connection to the earth. But the interpersonal bit is really more what I heard during my research. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this medicine that heals our sense of disconnectedness from one another, that sense of disconnectedness is quite a Western ailment. It's not something that you hear indigenous peoples, at least in Guatemala, but also indigenous peoples from all over the world. That's not something you hear them necessarily complaining about or citing as a common ailment, the sense of disconnection to each other and disconnection to the earth. Or it's maybe something that they recognize in kind of Western society. But I think the idea that cacao is like a heart healing medicine, and we need that heart healing medicine to bring us back into relationship with one another, um, is a very Eurocentric narrative, and kind of prioritizes the healing of Westerners over the healing of indigenous peoples. So I always kind of invite that inquiry of like, how can cacao be a medicine for more than just Westerners and more than just folks who are experiencing this sense of disconnection to themselves and to others? Yes, it's important to heal that, and cacao is amazing at doing that. But how can cacao also be a medicine for healing kind of social inequities and the environmental narrative, I think, is just as important. How can it bring us back into relationship with the earth? And yeah, that would be my answer.
Awesome. Thank you. So touching on that already on cacao and indigenous cultures, what are some of the misconceptions then with cacao and indigenous communities that we have as Westerners?
Yeah, so again, I just want to have a disclaimer that I would never want to position myself as a spokesperson for indigenous peoples, and my lens is very Guatemalan focused. I have much more experience in Guatemala than elsewhere in Latin America. So I'm more familiar with like the Maya cosmovision. But I think a lot of the misconceptions, the main misconception that I see kind of proliferating in this cacao ceremony phenomenon is the idea that this cacao ceremony is a reenactment of some kind of ceremony that happened way back in pre-Hispanic societies, which is just false. We actually have no idea what the ceremonial usage of cacao would have looked like in those pre-Hispanic societies. We have found trace amounts of theobromine in these vessels, these ceremonial vessels that have been excavated from archaeological sites. But archaeology is a lot of guesswork, and we actually don't have enough information to say what that would have looked like. The way that Indigenous peoples use cacao today is very different than the way you're going to consume cacao if you go to a cacao ceremony at a yoga studio here in London or in LA or in Cape Town, I would assume. So just I think it's important to recognize that this is not a reenactment of something that happened historically. It is a new age phenomenon, and it's not to say that a cacao ceremony can't be profoundly impactful, and create a space for transformation. But one of the biggest misconceptions I see is that we think we're hearkening back to this time in Indigenous past, and that's not necessarily true. I'm trying to think any other misconceptions. I think, well, actually, I'll save that bit because I think we're going to get into it later.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I think it's important always to acknowledge the root, the source, and to acknowledge Indigenous cultures and where cacao originally comes from. But absolutely, to claim something as this ancient cacao ceremony is 100% false. So always about conversations like this because they educate us, they inform us, and so we can just be a little bit more discerning and a bit more in integrity working with cacao. So thank you so much for highlighting that. So speaking of ethics, I suppose, or integrity and ethics, it's a very important topic to me. How do we interpret the ethics and sustainability narratives then surrounding ceremonial cacao specifically?
Yeah, so this was some findings that emerged from my research was that the ceremonial grade label, people interpret it as kind of a stamp of ethics and sustainability superiority. When there's no regulatory body, there's no universal set of standards. And so among ceremonial cacao producers, there's actually a huge range of different ethics and sustainability creeds. And so I think it's really important to do your due diligence and see who you're buying your cacao from and not just reading their website because obviously they're going to, play themselves up and you can't blame them for that. But there's a very wide spectrum of ethics frameworks, and a lot of countries that cacao is grown in, cacao is and chocolate have been profitable industries because wages are extremely low. There's no enforcement when it comes to labor practices. The kind of sustainability bit is very nebulous and not very well defined. Even terms like regenerative can be used to cover a whole blanket of agricultural practices. So I think doing your due diligence is just really important. There is definitely a desire to do good among almost all of the cacao producer collectives that I spoke to. There's this desire to embrace frameworks that are more ethical and more sustainable, but they're not always fully realized. So that's why I say the due diligence is important.
And I know this is a global narrative, not just in Guatemala. So hopefully your further research and your PhD, I'll put a plural on that, and your PhDs will also bring this into the light. Following on from that, then how can we better understand Indigenous cultures and the histories through cacao? And not only what should be done today, but just in general, just the appreciation and the respect and the reverence that they deserve.
Yeah. So I think for me, it's so important to understand the history of the places where cacao comes from. So obviously, I'm more well versed in Guatemalan history. It always surprises me how few people even those who have traveled to Guatemala, let alone those who are just drinking Guatemalan cacao, never having been there, are unaware that Guatemala went through several decades of prolonged civil war that was essentially a genocide against the indigenous peoples. 85% of the hundreds of thousands of people who were killed were indigenous Maya. Um, you know, without getting into too graphic detail, it was very brutal. Women and children, mass graves, and there are so many books that I could recommend on it if it's something that you're interested in, including Bitter Fruit by Stephen Schlesinger, who's an ex FBI, ex State Department in the US, because the US basically sponsored this state violence against indigenous people because of the commercial interests that they had in Guatemala at the time. And so I think it's really important to understand those histories. And I think when you and I spoke in Guatemala, we talked about how those memories are kind of sewn into the land, sometimes in quite a literal way, if we're talking about things like mass graves. And then that land that produces cacao, you know, is a conduit for those memories. And so I think it's really, yeah, important to do a bit of reading. The chocolate industry, and by extension, the cacao industry, are inextricable from those kind of violent colonial histories. Obviously, the Civil War and the genocide was just the most recent of those in Guatemala. There's been a whole series of them, and that's hardly unique to Guatemala. So I think it's also important to recognize that Maya today don't necessarily use cacao the way that we do. They will have it maybe at the beginning of a ceremony, but they also serve it to friends who come over. They have it in the morning instead of their coffee. It's not to say that the ceremonial aspect isn't meaningful, but yeah, I think that we tend to idealize this picture of what the indigenous Maya person looks like and how they behave and how they interact with cacao. And that idealized picture is more based on like past representations that are also quite fictionalized rather than what indigenous people, how they live today. And the fact that indigenous people in Guatemala and in many places in the world are still extremely marginalized and actively struggling against systems of structural oppression. And so I think that, yeah, that I think it's just important to acknowledge that it's not all rainbows and sunshine and butterflies.
Yeah. Thank you so much for highlighting that. In our previous conversation earlier in the year, you summarized so eloquently how you always speak, actually. But in this particular context, you said that as a generalization amongst Westerners and in our kind of increasingly secularized societies, there is a desire to reinvigorate some sense of the sacred. And I love that because it's so true for my personal journey as well, how it started, and so many people that I work with in Cape Cacao. So there's this desire to reinvigorate some sense of the sacred. And so we look at different schools of knowledge for how to do this. And cacao as a medicine and the Maya perspective as a cosmology is now globally accessible. So there are obviously some pros and cons with this. And can you just highlight some of the pitfalls, but also some of the positive aspects of this?
Yeah, so I might start with a personal anecdote. So I'm American. I grew up in the US. My heritage is Northern European, so Scandinavian and Scottish, among a few other things. And when I went to Guatemala, I felt quite an affinity with the Maya cosmovision, but I was also very conscientious that that was not my tradition to claim, or I didn't feel comfortable with the idea of claiming those beliefs as my own. And then when I moved to Scotland to do my first master's in international development, I had this kind of like profound experience of like reconnecting with my ancestral heritage and found that actually the Celtic cosmovision is quite similar. And there were a lot of overlaps, and I got really into herbalism and foraging and learned a lot about Viking runes and Celtic goddesses. I learned a bit of Gaelic. And so just to say that indigeneity is not something exotic that happens over here. It's something that we can also explore in the areas that are local to us. And um, we live in a space where like we live in a world where these kind of settler states have existed for a long time. And so um, I feel American, even though my ancestors were not necessarily from that soil. And so, how do you negotiate these like complicated feelings of like belonging and ownership? And um, it's complicated. So, I think my answer to your question would be cacao is an incredible way to connect with another cosmovision that allows us to feel like we are part of something greater than ourselves. And I think that that's like a core human need. You see it across history. The reason people have gravitated to organized religion, and now organized religion is becoming less popular, and people are kind of searching for something to hold on to. And in my unprofessional opinion, I think that's part of the reason that a lot of these very dogmatic political beliefs have become so popular. Um, so people are looking to something to give them that sense of meaning and larger purpose. But cacao is one. It's definitely not the only one. There are so many different religions and traditions, and it is beautiful to come to the study of these different traditions with humility and curiosity and not wanting to claim and evangelize, but getting interested and asking questions and exploring. And I think that doing that can be really beautiful and a really great way to reconnect with that sense of the sacred. Um, but like hold it lightly, it's like a little baby bird that you have between your hands. Just hold it lightly.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Wow. Um, yeah, I just want to actually land in that for a moment. Especially the part of that we are all part of our own culture, and sometimes that has been a little bit mixed and isn't just from one location, one geographical location over centuries, but we may have moved around, and we can still celebrate that. We can still learn about others, and celebrate other cultures, cosmovisions, traditions, but also just to root into what is true. Are we at that stage searching and grasping for straws because we're feeling a bit lost? In which case, that's just to be aware of that, and maybe not fixate so much on one particular way, and just have such respect for these traditions that have been going on for so much longer than we're going to be on this earth. And we all come from somewhere. We all come from something if we go far back enough. And I think that's generally this narrative of the seeker, the Western seeker. Where do I belong? So thank you for just putting that again so eloquently. Hold it like a little baby bird and just nurture that relationship that we are maybe our whole life going to be developing with our sense of belonging, our sense of place. So I think a final question here is really just to bring it right back to a core responsibility that I feel we have whenever we are consuming something. Nowadays, we vote with our money. So if we're going to be consumers of cacao, practitioners with cacao, what obligations do we have? Not only to the cacao, the land, but the people and the culture as well.
Yeah, I think it's such an important question to ask whether you are just a kind of lay consumer of cacao and having it every couple of weeks, going to ceremonies here and there, or whether you are engaging with it more deeply. Um, I think we have a moral obligation to do our due diligence, which I talked a bit about earlier. Know where your cacao comes from, like literally go there. Don't just read their website. Go visit the farm if you have the opportunity to, get to know the people, get to know what wages they're paid, what are the working conditions, ask questions, what are the agricultural practices that they're using, um, how is it processed, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I am a big advocate of treating cacao like the medicine that it is. So you don't necessarily take medicine every day. I don't have cacao every day. I know some people do. Um, what's taught in a lot of ceremonies is this kind of intuitive dosage. So your body will know how much cacao you need to have on that day. Um, cultivate that intuition. And as I've done that, I've found that actually I only have cacao once every week or so, maybe once every 2 weeks. And sometimes I go to a ceremony and my body's like, no, I'm actually good. Um, and it's I love treating cacao more like a fine wine. You know, you're not going to open your nicest bottle of wine at every dinner party. Um, it's the act of consumption. If we think about the act of consumption as being ceremonial, um, that you don't celebrate, you don't have a graduation ceremony every day. You know, it is special, it is occasional, and you really put the time and effort into it. And then think about how that act of ceremonial consumption can translate to other parts of your life. So, what would it look like if we consumed all of our goods ceremonially and really put that attention and intention into the act of consumption across consumer goods? Um, and then I would just say be attentive. We have an obligation to be attentive to this very fine line between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. And we exist in a world where there are these very uneven landscapes of power. And that means that dominant cultures can borrow from other traditions, but it's much harder in the reverse. So, I don't wear a beret when I drink a glass of French wine. So how can I show, I think I feel a moral obligation to constantly reflect on how can I, as a cacao consumer, show solidarity through my actions rather than like the performance of solidarity. Um, so what organizations am I donating to? Where am I buying my cacao from? Who am I sharing with? How often am I consuming it? All of those things are just really essential that we reflect on. And it's iterative, those reflections never end. It's always a process.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you so much, Daillen. And really looking forward to having you join our cacao training, our closed group next week. And I know that our trainees are going to have lots and lots and lots of questions for you after listening to this. So if anybody, apart from our cacao trainees that are obviously going to follow you for the next few decades, like myself, anybody that wants to follow your work and just find out what you are doing, how can they connect with you best?
So, yeah, I was just saying before we started this, I go back and forth on whether to use my personal Instagram as a professional one as well. But I am really committed to engaging with the public around my research. I think that that element of education is so important. So you can find me on Instagram, Daillen C, like my first name with my last initial, or feel free to drop me an email, dailenc@gmail.com, and we'd love to connect.
Awesome, awesome. And those little tags I will also put underneath this conversation. So thank you so much. Final piece. I know you've already said if there was a message that you'd want to share with the world, it's do your due diligence. Is there another message you would like to share with anybody wanting to start off, either starting off on their journey with cacao and wanting to do so in a respectful way, or those that are already working with cacao and just want to deeper into this way of being in reciprocity with people and land?
I think it might be that cacao, like so many plants, has a lot to offer, and it is worth the time and effort to get to know these different plant medicines more deeply and do your research, I guess. I keep coming back to this research due diligence. But I think, yeah, that deeper engagement of getting to know how a plant operates. And um, during my forest bathing training, we did these plant studies where we went and spent time with different plants in different seasons and saw them through their entire life cycle. And um, with cacao, like try preparing it different ways, try drinking it at different times of day, like get to know the plant and not just as a food, but like go to a cacao plantation and like see the fruit and have you've had the fruit blended up in a licuado like they have in Guatemala. Like it's delicious. And most people who have only eaten chocolate have never had that. And it's like, oh, it's amazing. So yeah, I think just that deeper engagement is really important.
Mm. Ditto, ditto, ditto. It really deepened my relationship. The first time was a few years ago now, was in Bali, and actually going to see how the cacao trees grow and seeing how the fruit grows on the trees, seeing how tiny those flowers are, seeing the unique, just the unique form of those trees and where they were in the rest of it was a bit of a wild uh, area, how they were naturally, but then also how they were cultivated, and then how they were when we opened them up and the fresh seeds and fruit, and then how all the different stages of the processing. It just was a whole nother level, I would say a deep dive into this appreciation. Yeah, so definitely do your research, and as soon as you can, anybody that's listening, as soon as you can, go actually see how the trees grow on the land and how the people work with the trees, and ask the questions. Make sure that anything that you're supporting is being done in harmony. In harmony, I think it's a nice summary. And where
Yeah.
Daillen and I actually met was a place called Tuktukilal, which means harmony. And I just love that summarizes so much our relationship with each other. May it be harmonious, our relationship with nature, with cacao specifically, and just the global web of everything: spirit, people, land, elements. May it all be harmonious. So, in a harmonious piece of gratitude, thank you so much for your time today in this conversation. Just in honor of the spirit of cacao and closing off this space, the ceremonial chat, I'm going to ask us again just to bring a hand to the heart. Close the eyes. Anybody listening in as well, just take a few moments, allow some deeper breaths, and just drop inwards into the heart. Receive the shared conversation here. And thanking Daillen for her time and effort, not only in this conversation, but all the years she has spent getting to know cacao, getting to know the people, getting to know the culture, the history, the land. May the spirit of cacao continue to work through her. And thank you for the spirit of technology bringing us here today to be able to share this wisdom to all the people that have worked with cacao before us, to the original wisdom keepers, to Mother Nature herself, to the heart of the sky and the heart of the earth, and to our own hearts. Thank you. Another deep breath. I'm wishing you a beautiful day further. I look forward to our next conversation, and I really look forward to following your PhDs. I keep saying that as a plural, like you're just going to be doing many
They take
PhDs.
so long. There's no way I'm doing more than one. They're like way too long for that. But I appreciate your confidence in my academic abilities.
You just keep drinking cacao, so you'll find the energy and the time. Thanks,
Thank you,
Daillen.
Fran.
Much love.